Dr. Koch, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to VOA Persian.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You have said that the United States still does not have the capacity to stream satellite-based free internet access to the people of Iran, but you have emphasized that we have the technology and capability to do that. Could you elaborate on that?
No, there are a number of remarkable new technologies that have emerged in the last couple of years, really since the terrible hurricanes of Harvey and Maria, when we lost internet capability in Puerto Rico and here in the United States in more remote areas. And so we worked to develop the ability to stream internet via satellite. And that has now reached a commercial viability. And Elon Musk, for example, has Starlink. He's releasing thousands of satellites. That's a commercial application, but if we could do that securely through a government channel, it would not be cost prohibitive, and it would give us the ability to basically what I've called exporting free speech. It's not an act of war, it's not an act of aggression, it's simply giving people who are striving for their freedom the ability to communicate.
You've said before that the NSC, as you mentioned, worked to remedy this failure because back then you didn't have that capability and establish a secure and reliable means to bypass Tehran's Beijing-style censorship and firewall, while previous efforts had focused on circumventing the NIN, the National Internet Network, as the whole source of bandwidth in Iran. We began to look to new capabilities to bypass it altogether. What do you mean by bypass it altogether?
Well, that you need to come up with an ability to give free access, and if you are even touching the national system, they will have the capacity to reach into your system. So using the satellite-based as a way to avoid that altogether makes it the most secure and prevents the government from having the ability to identify individual users. So that's why that's important.
So how could you deploy that capability?
I don't want to get into too many details, but it is, as I said, satellite-based. There would probably be a hardware component in country that you would need to get in, but the fact of the matter is it is doable, and we're starting to see some interest in this from Capitol Hill. Representative Salazar, for example, has legislation. She wants to go through the Air Force. We had thought it would be better to go through USAID to emphasize that this was not an aggressive action in any way, but there are reasons you could do it either way, but it's great to see interest from the Hill.
So the interest on the Hill that you before that mentioned is this is the latest development, and you hope that it's going to resonate with other lawmakers?
Well, and it's a way to keep developing the idea because the technology does keep changing, and so we want to stay current with those developments and make sure somebody in the government is continuing to build out the idea.
In terms of the China factors, because you also before this mentioned that China is its efforts to dominate the emerging frontier of satellite internet access. How concerning is that?
It's deeply concerning because, as you mentioned, I mean, Tehran has imported its oppression apparatus from Beijing. It's the same playbook that they used after Tiananmen Square, and anytime there's any kind of uprising, Hong Kong a couple of years ago. So they are looking aggressively for ways to prevent there being free internet access, and it's been fascinating to watch it over the last 20 years in China, where they have what they refer to, I think unironically, as the Great Firewall, trying to block things off from the people of China. That more and more that becomes impossible, and information in all of its various forms is getting in to mainland China, and what they're ultimately able to do about that, I don't know, but certainly they're looking for solutions.
Another major event that during your directorship at NSC happened was the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the former commander of Quds Force, which happened in January 2020, about a month
January
before.
3.
Yeah. The next day, actually, the January 4th of 2020, the Department of Homeland Security warned of a potential Iranian cyber attack in the aftermath of the death of Soleimani. Did Iran conduct any such attack? Are you aware of that?
There were certainly actions that looked like they might have been Iranian that were not successful. There was one against Israel, for example. We get attacked all day, every day. So, sometimes it's a little bit hard to figure out who the attacker is. The main point, I think, is that, we expected pushback from Iran. I mean, obviously, that would mean it was a major decision that the president took and a very significant action. And so, usually you would expect some kind of dramatic counteraction. What was interesting is one has not yet come. And it leads you maybe to decide that one thing that the regime in Tehran understands are shows of strength. And if you show them weakness or appeasement, then they're going to push on you. If you push back on them, that's going to give them food for thought.
On June of 2019 and September of 2019, while you were there at White House, the U.S. conducted a number of retaliatory cyber attacks on Iran after downing of a U.S. drone and attacks against Saudi oil facilities and tankers. How much you were involved? What was the target, and what did you learn from those retaliatory attacks?
Well, really, that's not the role of the NSC to pick targets. If it is, then you've got a problem. So much more it was getting options to the president after the attacks on the ships in Fujairah, the attacks on Abqaiq. What are our options? And President Trump was certainly not interested in another Middle East war, but at the same time, he was not interested in letting the Iranians run roughshod over the region. So I think for him, he wanted to find, those types of actions that would get their attention, but not escalate into something uncontrollable.
One thing I would like to ask is how vulnerable is Iran's cyber defense, in your opinion?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think we can fall into the trap of thinking, the Iranians are 100 feet high, they're, all powerful, and have, an iron grip on the country. I don't think that's so, for reasons I'm sure we'll discuss. But, at the same time, they have aggressively accelerated their cyber capabilities and their cyber defenses and their cyber offensive capabilities. And so I think it's something we have to keep a very close eye on and make sure, we're staying a step ahead.
On October 2019, Microsoft said that the Iranian hacker group tried to breach accounts associated with President Trump's re-election campaign, as well as the accounts of journalists and U.S. officials. What were you thinking back then? Because this actually happened during your time, and what was the reaction?
No, it's very frightening, and every time you turn on your computer and there's a blip, you wonder. But it's also part of the cost of doing business, and particularly on the National Security Council staff, nothing in our personal capacities, that they might be attacking was part of our professional duties, if that makes sense. It's different equipment, it's different systems. They never mash or combine. So you feel pretty secure that your professional life is being properly taken care of.
Were you thinking that you were personally under attack for that sort of?
You never know. My Gmail was hacked in the spring of 2020. Was it the Iranians? Was it somebody else? I don't know.
What would you say to those who argue that the crisis we are witnessing in Vienna in the nuclear talks is the result of President Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA?
I do not think that's the case. I think the results of Vienna are the responsibility of the people who initiated those talks. And we're now, I believe, in round 8 in as many months of discussions in Vienna, and we appear to be going backwards, not forwards. And certainly the fact that the bulk of Iran's most aggressive enrichment activities have been over the course of these 8 months, I think suggests they saw a real opportunity with the Biden administration that they did not see with the Trump administration.
You have also been an advisor to former Secretary of Energy. There is a challenge that I couldn't find an answer, and probably a good answer for it, which is China's continuation of buying Iranian cheap oil. How could U.S. manage to crack down on that?
Basically, the way we did it was by going granular. We went after every shipment that we could identify, worked closely with governments like Panama, for example, to deflag the ships so they couldn't get insurance. And if you make it enough of a nuisance, China's not going to go to a huge amount of bother. They like the cheap oil, but ultimately, if you make it too much of a nuisance for them, they're going to tamp down. And we got that number pretty low, I believe under 100,000 barrels a day. Now I understand, I don't know, but I understand it to be closer to 1 million because those activities are not being rigorously engaged in. There were encouraging noises out of the administration last week, I believe, that they were considering becoming more aggressive on oil smuggling. I hope that's the case. It's a lot of work. I mean, it's hard. And if, on the one hand, you're trying to negotiate with them in Vienna, and on the other hand, you're detaining their tankers, maybe that seems inconsistent. But it was always my opinion that if you gave the regime a financial lifeline, which is what this represents, that then they're just going to hang on. And the whole point of the maximum pressure campaign was to build leverage with them so that they would feel like they had to make a deal the way they had at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. That survival will trump ideology for them ultimately. And that was our theory, is if we made it sufficiently painful for them, they would have to relinquish the nuclear program. The Biden administration took another policy.
I was interviewing Dennis Ross, Ambassador Ross, a few days ago, and he was saying that actually the Trump administration isolated the United States.
I think the fact that we achieved the historic Abraham Accords between 4 Muslim-majority countries and Israel and the United States in the last year of the administration, after the maximum pressure campaign, suggests absolutely the opposite. It suggests that we as the United States were able to better integrate Israel into the Arab world than any president in more than a quarter of a century. And so, for me, that's evidence of growing U.S. influence and growing U.S. integration into the region, and conversely, the isolation of Iran. I mean, I can't think of anything Iran disliked more it's probably a long list of things they didn't like about us too much, but the fact that UAE and Bahrain in particular, very close neighbors of Iran's, would take the momentous step of recognizing Israel and establishing diplomatic ties suggests they think that's where their security and economic future lie.
But if the goal for the maximum pressure was to crack down on Iran's nuclear activity as one main outcome, this didn't happen. I mean, Iran expanded its activities under the maximum pressure.
They did, although at a much lower rate than they have over the course of the last year. And I think had President Trump had a second term, the economic pressure was becoming intolerable. And that was kind of the theory behind it, is that there would be this period where they might expand some activities, but at the same time, ultimately, they would have to make a choice between economic survival and the nuclear program. And it seemed to us, given their history, ultimately they would choose survival.
There was an op-ed a few days ago on Washington Post arguing about whether the U.S. can live with a nuclear-armed Iran the way it has lived with the Soviet Union, China, India, and Pakistan. Can the U.S. live with a nuclear-armed Iran?
I think we certainly don't want to. And if the example of North Korea tells us anything, that this turns into a very thorny, intractable problem. And the issue I see now with the activity of the Iranians over the last particularly 10 months is, once they have the knowledge of how to do this, whether or not they're actually enriching becomes somewhat academic, because you can't take the knowledge out of somebody's head. Once they know this, have certain technologies, and they seem to be continuing on with their so-called space launches. which everybody expects is actually a missile system, and that's deeply concerning. So I would hate to have the legacy of the Biden administration or any administration be that Iran got the bomb on their watch.
In David Slink, History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art, you wrote, free systems can spring up in the most unlikely of places, and the inspiring force of freedom can result in creative achievements of the highest order. It may be impossible to predict where and when the next chapter of this story will emerge, but history gives us reason to be confident that once again another hand will reach out to grasp David Slink. When you see constant protests in Iran on a almost weekly basis recently, are you hopeful that Iran may be the next in the history of liberal democracy?
I would certainly be hopeful. I'm old enough to remember when Iran was our friend, and that was a much more desirable state of affairs. I think certainly, the Shah's family don't think the country should go back to being a monarchy, and that a modern democracy would be desirable for the people of Iran. And what makes me most hopeful as a historian, and I think you might sympathize with this, is if 75 years ago I had told you three of the great democratic capitalist allies of the United States were going to be Germany, Japan, and Israel, you would tell me I was insane. We had just fought huge world wars against Japan and Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, and Israel had existed for 15 minutes and the prospects didn't look good. So I think, I'm not 75, mercifully, but looking back over that trajectory, it can happen. And it usually happens best with the partnership and the leadership of the United States in the modern era, and that would be my great hope for both the people of Iran and the people of the United States, that we could get to that kind of relationship, which could be fantastically productive for both countries.
Dr. Coase, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.